We're looking at the UN decade now. We've moved from a year to a decade. I know you're going to deliberate further upon it, but at least we've had the initial discussion. What's the whole point of that document? What do you think is going to move us to?
Well, I think it's a very much welcome document, very, very timely, at a point in our history when the grassroots demands for reparations have gone on to the table of the heads of governments of the CARICOM, and they're also pressing home, issues of reparations. And despite, some of the differences, the fact of the matter is that, the moving from a year of people of African descent to a decade of people of African descent is a huge opportunity for African people, not just in the diaspora, but also on the continent, indeed all over the world, to come together, in order to push forward, through the channels of the United Nations, as well as through non-governmental channels, particularly through our own grassroots formations, all over the world, the issues that are there, and to be able to educate ourselves upon the documents of the decade, interpret them in our own best interest, but most importantly, to connect it to the most important topical demand for African people of the moment, which is the right to Africa in terms of not just the land, not just in terms of peoplehood, but in terms of the wealth of Africa that continues to be pillaged and misused, whilst the vast majority of African people continue to wallow in poverty. Taking control of Africa, its people, its resources, for them to be better utilized, with full respect for African human peoples and Mother Earth rights, utilized in such a way that we can lift ourselves powerfully through our own agency and become what we ought to be, what our struggles have been about for hundreds of years. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to once again use the governmental and non-governmental channels of the United Nations, and its member states, our communities, mindful of the fact that the United Nations Charter actually begins with we the peoples of the United Nations, not we the states of the United States, we the peoples of the United. So through the channels of the United, we've done it before, we can use the United Nations channels to progress our grassroots agenda at local, national, and international levels, and make sure that within this decade, a whole decade of action led by people of African descent, but focused on reclaiming the land and wealth of the continent for Africans at home and abroad, we can make a different world so that the Africa that comes out at the end of this decade is an Africa that empowers us, that empowers humanity, where we return ourselves, to our rightful place in leading the world in creating a new civilization.
So how do you think this piece of paper or declaration is going to make that tangible, practical difference in terms of the economic, changing economic paradigm that we
Well,
have?
that is the interpretation we give to it. What is silent in the document so far is the right of people of African descent to claim and collectively own Africa, its land, its resources, be part of its peoplehood. This is what is silent in this document, right? But there are enough provisions in the document for us to interpret it and advance it in our own way. This is actually United Nations practice. Now, if we begin, in my view, in studying the document carefully, understanding, how to use it in legal and extra-legal terms, educating particularly African youth all over the continent and diaspora on how to interpret this in terms of actions they should take, how to connect themselves, as they say, globally. That is linking the local situations where they find themselves, with the global situation of African people. Ensuring that particularly in schools, colleges, and universities, they are guaranteed the right there to educate themselves on Africanness, on their history, their culture, to begin to educate themselves in such a way that the knowledge they gain, the skills they learn from education is about empowering themselves, transforming themselves, and transforming themselves as part of their local communities, and that are connected to our global whole as African people, to ensure that the resources in everywhere, African resources everywhere, are utilized best for the interest of African people at home and abroad. This is very, very, that becomes what we insist upon. That if you are, for example, in Obuasi in Ghana today, the gold mines must be something that belongs to the local community. And if it is not used for the benefit of the local community with the support of African people worldwide, that is the whole point. That African people worldwide should begin to take an interest in African lives at local, national, and international level, and unify our efforts to control our resources and use them for our benefit. What we cannot use, let's block others from pillaging them to use for their own enrichment. Yes, the huge resources of Africa. If we cannot use them, let them lie where they are until we have equipped ourselves with the knowledge, the skills, and the international connections to use those resources for the betterment of African people at home and abroad. If that is what flows educationally from this document, then we can see the qualitative transformation of African people, not just mentally, but also in terms of the organizational power, the global organizing force that we can become to make what even the United possibly did not intend. And that is, for me, what are the possibilities in this decade. It's come back to us. It's about agency. It's about our own use of the document, our own interpretation of this document. And if we do that creatively, I think we would advance. By the end of the decade, we will be living in a new world, because, even if we don't fully achieve its declared objectives, we would have put ourselves in a position of global power, globally interconnected, no longer isolated from each other as we are, no longer disorientated as we are, focused on retaining Africa in terms of its peoplehood, its land, its resources to African people at home and abroad. And I think that is a possibility out of this decade.
You spend time deliberating over this document, and I'm sure you're going to come back to it. But initial response as to what is it about for the ordinary African who wasn't here, and what are the possibilities or the expectations that we can take from it?
Greetings. Well, my initial thoughts on the International Decade for people of African descent are positive. We shouldn't just see this as a UN framework that the UN have crafted up for us. We should see this as a framework that includes within it much of the struggles, much of the demands, the voices of our own African freedom fighters. And it's really a platform for, if you like, mainstreaming our African grassroots agenda for liberation, which is not a new agenda, it's an old one, but each generation we renew it and we look at the times. So the decade offers us an opportunity, I believe, to regroup, to reassess, to rededicate and recommit ourselves to a plan of action towards our continued liberation. And it has very practical and tangible outcomes. So I'm not talking about liberation in the ether. I'm talking about liberation in such a way that our material lives will be transformed. Liberation in such a way that our children no longer have to feel ashamed of who they are. Liberation in such a way that we are proud to claim our African identity, culture and heritage, because we know there is an inherent power within that, and we know that, you know, no group or no people can excel unless they work to develop their own house, as it were. So the decade offers us space, if you like, a fighting space, but also a creative space, an intellectual space, an organizational space, a spiritual space, to really look at who we are as African people, what has become of us and what will become of us if we don't actually learn the lessons of history. We don't learn the lessons about the need for us to unify in our own best strategic interests. Not just all African people together in a room or all in the world. No, it's really about looking at those people, those forces, those institutions and organizations which have always been asserting African sovereignty, African self-determination, African dignity, African values, and for us to assert those. I'm also looking at the potential of this decade to deliver for us, not because it's just going to do that by osmosis, but because we use it as an opportunity to mobilize and galvanize our own forces, our own people, to give them a vision of something that they can connect to, because we know that wise saying, where there is no vision, the people perish. Our people have largely lost a sense of the power of what it means to be African. And it's not just a historical identifier and a cultural identifier. It's about a power. It's a power that, you know, many of us in the diaspora wanted to connect with when we saw Africa as a fighting force. We wanted to identify with that. But then the Africa that gets presented today is not an Africa that people want to identify with. People of African descent, so-called, of the diaspora, who may not self-define as African or may not have been socialized or brought up in families where they identified as African. We need to give them a true picture of Africa. And we need to give them a picture of Africa that has always been there. And in particular, we must show the reality about Africa. We must reconnect our people once again to those liberation forces, those people who still exist on the continent, those communities who are still resisting the structural adjustment programs, resisting the privatization measures, resisting corruption, resisting some of the efforts by so-called politicians and governmental leaders to literally take away the resources that rightfully belong to the people. We need to connect with them. Another way of saying that is Pan-Africanism. We need to reignite, refuel our Pan-African struggle. For some reason, many people feel that's a dirty word, but actually it's Pan-Africanism. And the decade in itself needs to be utilized. And I'm not saying that this is there in the official UN programs. I'm saying that we must always, it's like you're engaging in a form of warfare. We need to be strategic. We need to know how to utilize what may look like very mainstream, non-confrontational frameworks and norms and values and laws that all humans can benefit from. But we need to know how to use that to advance our group and collective interests, which is what all other people do very well, but we struggle with. And the decade and its programs of action give us an opportunity to do that once again. And it's about reclaiming that legacy and ensuring that we maintain our own agenda, but we utilize the platforms, the resources, human, material and otherwise. We utilize the opportunity for this conversation about Africa and all things African, and to talk about the condition of people of African descent, to link us back to what it is that's actually going to give us resources, what it is that's going to free us from discrimination, what it is that's going to free us from not being considered serious players, what it is that's going to free us from this charity industrial complex and white saviours who feel that, they've probably been put here to redeem us and they have some special mission. It's what it is that's going to get us to really see the root causes of our problems and our situation, and to know that the root causes of that lie in our dispossession, lie in our disconnectedness and our, if you like, this denial of our right to belong, this denial of our identity and what it means to be African, and what it means to be part of a community, what it means to be part of a collective, what it means to be a citizen of Africa, even if we are not physically located on the continent, what it means to see Africa as our home, what it means to be a responsible African wherever we are, so that we do not lose our allegiance to our motherland. And, for me, as someone who is a reparationist, which means a reparations activist, the essential aspect of our repair is to repair our fractured relations with one another. First of all, our African identity and self-concept and our kind of collective consciousness of African people, but also then to look at what does that mean to be African? What are the responsibilities of being African? There are responsibilities of belonging to a people that have bequeathed so much to the world, but yet the descendants and the rightful heirs are not able to benefit from what our foreparents and our ancestors have given to humanity. And so I believe that it really offers an opportunity. I'm thinking about many young people that I know, many young people in my family who have been given a skewed image of Africa. It gives us an opportunity to really show Africa and to show her people, and for us to recognize our connections to one another, for us to begin to communicate with one another across linguistic divides, across so-called ethnic divides, across national divides, and recognize that actually, no matter what we call ourselves, no matter where we live, no matter what passport we may or may not hold, we have so much in common. We have much more in common than we have that divides us. And I believe that there will be opportunities if we are strategic, if we are able to politicize our African identity, that we can gain some of the gains that, for instance, indigenous peoples have. Because they had a year, they had a decade on indigenous peoples, and then there's now an international convention on the rights of indigenous peoples, which codifies, if you like, indigenous legal frameworks and perspectives in so-called mainstream international law. And we have an opportunity to codify our own African conceptualizations of justice within international law in a way that's not just going to benefit those of us in the know, that can benefit our people wherever they are on this planet, so that we can regain territories, we can regain resources, we can look at our ancestral knowledge and traditions, everything that makes a human being, or a people, that glue that binds us together, that peoplehood which gives us a sense of purpose, meaning and direction, and to regain this identification with Africa, because that's one of the things that was damaged. And that link, if you like, every generation, there's been an attempt to sever the link of Africa's children who are dispersed, some voluntarily, some involuntarily. Those of us that have been dispersed, we need to reconnect back to our source, our mother, that which nourishes us, and not only us, that which has nourished all of human civilization. And I believe it's a great time. It's a great time to be African. Especially, I think about myself, who was born to parents who did not identify as being African. Somebody who has had to learn what it means to be African. Someone who has had to fight, literally, even amongst, I mean, not physically, but fight spiritually, emotionally, culturally, politically, for my right to be African. I've had to do that against all the odds, and there are many more people like me. And now I'm so glad that I took up that journey. And I guess I have a message as well for many of my brothers and sisters who are African, that, you know, at a time when many of us in the diaspora are wanting to reclaim and reconnect and see the power of Africa and the resources and everything that Africa has given to humanity, there are so many who, if you like, have been more connected to that, who want to be throwing it off and want to be anything but. And I feel that I have a message for those people. And the message is that you don't know what wealth it is that you are throwing away. We are literally giving up riches to be sitting down and to have trinkets and pennies. And so we must, and this is part of the conditioning, and I believe that this decade and all the educational programs are going to encourage many of us who have forgotten or who are afraid or who don't fully understand to truly reconnect and understand what it means to be African. We must remember that this is also quite historic, I would say prophetic, because when many of us left the continent of Africa, whether it was hundreds of years ago or in recent decades, we didn't necessarily leave as Africans. We left with other identities. And so, if you like, being African is a futuristic identity. It's not about history. It's about what we all still have to become. Even those who are born on the continent of Africa, we're not yet fully African because we're in a homeland that is not ours. The borders are still European. So much of the education, so much of the religious and moral frameworks are not ours. So all of us have to learn and struggle again to defend the bit of Africanness that we have, but also for our right to create, our right to evolve, and our right to actually define for ourselves the kind of people that we must be if we are to harness the gains of previous generations, if we are to honour our fathers and our mothers, but more importantly, if we are to leave this planet, this earth, and Africa to our children who are inheritors of this rich legacy.
In 2011, towards the tail end, I started the project, and people hadn't heard of it just for the year. We've started a decade, and even in this room, they've come to this project, and it's new to people. So what are you guys going to be doing to make people outside of this parliament and your immediate surroundings know that there's this declaration?
Okay, well, what we'll be doing here in the Interim National African People's Parliament, we are a learning institution, so we promote education and training and learning and sharing amongst all of us. In leadership, those who are rank and file members, those who just come to a meeting, because there is so much about who we are that we still have yet to recover. So we'll be focusing on a program of mass public education and conscientization and mobilization that is linked to ongoing movements such as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, which is not just about financial compensation. Essentially, the root of reparations is about repairing, and what most needs to be repaired is our reconnection to Africa and to African people. And so we will be utilizing our political campaigns, which are against state repression and reparations, to promote the positive aspects of the programs of action that are currently there, the themes of recognition, justice and development. We will be helping our people through our various forums, public meetings, training programs and other fora to give meaning to this, to provide a different lens and way of looking at this decade beyond just, if you like, an academic conference or a lecture, which I'm sure we're going to have a lot of. We're going to work with our people methodically. We are going to do it in a way where we're going to give practical application to linking African people by organising and by joining forces with other similar institutions outside of the UK, across Europe and across the African diaspora, and most importantly though, linking right back to our motherland, Africa. So we're going to be engaging in information exchange around our different experiences, but our collective situation and what it is that we need to do together. So INAP has committed itself to doing that, and we engage in many kind of different forums, and in particular our expertise in the community law circle that we have just had is to raise awareness and to, if you like, educate the wider African public and also non-Africans who are conscientious and work in support of our cause about the legal dimensions of Africanness, the legal dimensions of asserting a positive African identity, the legal dimensions of what it means to be a global African citizen and to exercise our rights to Africa and her resources, and the responsibility to Africa, and to share in the many challenges that Africa and her peoples also face.